In this video, I want to go over some connective tissues and finish off our tissues handout. So what I want to start with is areolar connective tissue. So if we take a look at areolar here, you can see that it's got a very open matrix and lots of fibers going on in here. And you can see we've got some thin fibers that are branching, so there's an intersecting point there. You can see some squiggles in these finer branching fibers, and you can see some thicker fibers. There's one right there. The thicker fibers are the collagen fibers. They don't branch or wave too much. And the thinner fibers, these are the elastic fibers. They are branching, wavy, and they also have squiggles in them. So that lets them stretch and return to normal length. We also have matrix and nuclei of fibroblasts. So the nuclei of the fibroblasts, recall from lecture that areolar connective tissue contains lots of different cells, fibrocytes, mast cells, melanocytes, all kinds of stuff. But with our rather inexpensive microscopes and slides, we can't really tell the difference between these cells. So we're just going to call anything that's dark, any of these dark circle looking things, we're just going to call these all fibroblasts. And so those are the nuclei of the fibroblasts. Everything else that's not protein, fiber, or cell is going to be matrix for areolar connective tissue. Our next tissue is adipose tissue, and we need to know adipocytes, fat vacuole, and nucleus for this tissue type. So here we can see some adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is mostly cells, and these cells are called the adipocytes, and they are specialized for storing fat. So you can see the outline of the cell here. There's an adipocyte, and the white space in the middle of the adipocyte is basically stored fat, and it stores it in a specialized organelle called a fat vacuole. And as that fat vacuole swells up with fat, the little nucleus gets pushed to the side of the cell. And so you can't really see too many nuclei in here. There might be one right there, but they are always pushed to the side. And so you have this very tight fitting arrangement of cells. Don't misidentify this as simple squamose, because in simple squamose, although the cells fit together like they do here, you can see the nuclei very clearly. Our next tissue type is dense regular connective tissue, or you may hear it called dense fibrous. And we need to know collagen fiber bundles and nuclei of fibroblasts. So with dense regular or dense fibrous, what you're looking for here is you can see the fibers here, and they're stained in purple. The white is open space between the fibers. So if you can imagine taking a piece of yarn and just flattening it out and spreading out the fibers, you would have little white spaces in between. That's a good clue that you're dealing with dense fibrous. So each of these little bundles is one of the collagen fiber bundles. The nuclei of the fibroblasts are the dark staining structures, and on this slide you can see them quite well. Don't confuse this with smooth muscle, and we'll take a look at that coming up. But dense fibrous, you're seeing this very parallel looking fibers that just continue on throughout the tissue. They don't really come to pointed ends like they do in smooth muscle. Next, we have hyaline cartilage, and we only need a couple of structures, chondrocytes and lacuna, and matrix for this tissue type. So this is the same slide we looked at a minute ago, and this right here is the adipose tissue. This area is the hyaline cartilage, and you can tell hyaline cartilage because it looks sort of like jelly beans, where you have these spaces within the cartilage, and sometimes the cells are filling up the space, other times, like in this example right here, the cell has pulled back a little bit. But the space within the cartilage matrix is called the lacuna, and the cell that lives there is called the chondrocyte. So that's why we say chondrocyte and lacuna. And you can see some more there. Everything else that's not a chondrocyte or it's not a space is going to be matrix. So here we have our cartilaginous matrix, which is made up of those proteoglycans. Next, we've got bone tissue, and we need to know osteon, osteocyte and lacuna, canaliculi, and central canal in this tissue. So at 40x, you can see we've got a little square of bone tissue here, and each one of these little columns is one of the osteons. So there's an osteon, there's an osteon. So what I want to do to see the actual structures is to zoom in on a particular osteon and take a look. So here you can see a good example of an osteon. So this overall rounded structure is your osteon. This is your central canal, the dark area in the middle of the osteon, and this carries blood vessels. The osteocytes in their lacuna are arranged in these concentric lamella, which are like layers basically surrounding the central canal. Then you have your canaliculi, which are going to radiate out. They're little bits of, they're basically allowing blood to flow from the central canal to the osteocytes. So if we take a closer look here, we can see those pretty well. These little wispy lines radiating out are the canaliculi. Next, we've got blood. Here we're looking at a blood smear at 400x, and we can see lots and lots and lots of these real lightly, fairly round structures. These are the erythrocytes, and you can see tons and tons of erythrocytes. The dark staining structures, these are the leukocytes, and the dark structure that stains on them is the nucleus. So some of the nuclei you can see here, this one's got many lobes to it, but you can identify a leukocyte based on the staining of it. We also have one other formed element, the platelets, which are right here. And the platelets are little packets of cytoplasm that aid in clotting, and they're going to appear as just little fragments. So maybe right there could be a platelet, that could be a platelet, that could be a platelet right there. And then everything else is going to be plasma. So all the space around the cells, in this case is just white space, that would be your plasma. So that's the matrix of this fluid connective tissue, is plasma. That's going to finish off our connective tissues, and so next we're going to move on to muscle tissue. So our first muscle is skeletal muscle, and we need muscle fiber, striation, and nucleus. So if we take a look at 100x, you can't really see a whole lot going on yet, but you can see that we've got a lot of fibers going on. So if I move on up to 400, what you can see at this point is you can see the striations. So the striations are real fine lines that run. So here is your muscle fiber, and you can see these very fine lines running perpendicular to the muscle fiber. Those are the striations. So if you see striations, there's a good chance it's going to be skeletal muscle. There's some really good striations right there. So I'm real happy with those. Here you can see real defined striations, and what makes the striations is the alternation of basically thick and thin filaments and the zone of overlapping within the sarcomere. So we'll learn more about that. You can also see we've got nuclei in here. So there's your nucleus right there. There's a nucleus, darkly staining structures. So if we see nice fibers and nice striations, you're probably looking at skeletal muscle tissue. Next, we've got smooth muscle tissue. On this slide, we're looking at a cross-section of an intestinal wall here. And so you can see that we've got our little extensions going into the intestinal space right here, and we've got our simple columnar epithelial tissue. But what we're looking for is the smooth muscle on this slide. And so this would be the longitudinal layer here. So zooming in, you can't really see a whole lot going on. We're going up to 400x. And so with smooth muscle, this can be quite difficult, but right away, you notice you don't see those white spaces like you did with dense regular. The muscle fibers or the muscle cells are really closely packed. You don't have a lot of white space in between. And so that's a good clue that it's smooth muscle. Also, you don't see any striations. So no striations and no big open white spaces is a good clue that it's smooth muscle. Also, smooth muscle cells come to a point. So you can see here, these are tapered or pointed at the ends. So if you see something that has pointed ends, there's a good chance that it's smooth muscle tissue. And if you look at all these nuclei, they all have pointed ends right there. And so real good indication that you're looking at smooth muscle. So we need to know nucleus, cytoplasm, cell membrane. Can't really see the cell membranes too well. The nuclei are the darkly staining structures. Cytoplasm is everything else. So there's a couple more shots of what you might see with smooth muscle tissue. Again, this one is quite difficult and looks a lot like dense regular. Our last muscle type is cardiac muscle, and we need to know cardiocyte, nucleus, striations, and intercalated discs. So right away you see in cardiac muscle that there's a lot going on here. And it's worth noting that you can see striations in cardiac muscle tissue just like in skeletal muscle tissue. And so the big difference is going to be these intercalated discs right here. And so along with the striations running perpendicular to the actual fiber, the intercalated discs run perpendicular to the fiber, but they're quite dark in coloration. And so you can see intercalated discs really well on this slide. And if you see intercalated discs, you're definitely looking at cardiac muscle tissue. And so the way these cells are arranged is you basically have one short cell with one nucleus in it, and it's connecting via the intercalated disc to the next cell. So these dark staining structures are the nuclei. The individual muscle cells are called cardiocytes. And we got everything there. Our final tissue type is neural tissue. So we need to know neuron, cell body, cell process, nucleus, and nucleus of the neuroglia cells. So if you take a look at neural tissue, here we are at 100x. And first of all, it looks very much like a cobweb, or very cobwebby. And the neurons are the individual nerve cells, and they're going to stain quite dark in coloration. So this would be a neuron here. If you just draw a circle around the main part of this is your cell body, or the soma. And then extensions coming off of it are the cell processes. So we will learn later in the course that these are dendrites and axons, but for now we're just going to call them cell processes. The nucleus you can see is an even darker staining structure inside the cell body of the neuron. And then the neuroglia cells are the dark staining structures surrounding the neuron. So there's like hundreds of neuroglia for every one neuron. So that's pretty straightforward. And I hope you found this video helpful on learning the connective tissues, muscle, and nervous tissue.